Hi and welcome to the podcast for session 4 of KV518. In this podcast I'm going to talk a little bit about the assessment task for this module, and in particular some suggestions and pointers about making the presentation that you're going to be giving to colleagues in your work setting that hopefully then you'll be able to record and hand in as part of the assessment task for the module. There are some other elements that go along with the actual presentation that you record. In particular, there are 4 practice recordings and your learning contracts, but I'll give you some further information about those particular aspects later on in the year. So in this podcast, I'm just going to go through a bit about the focus on the task that you're undertaking, the kind of the way you might go about making the presentation, some guidance about slides and use of PowerPoint, things like that, and a bit of an overview of the criteria, and then touching at the end on self-evaluation and review. So, thinking overall in terms of the task for this module, and this goes back to the introduction I gave at the beginning of the year. The idea behind this is that you are identifying a particular aspect of your work that is of interest to you, that's relevant to you in your setting, that's going to offer you a challenge in terms of your investigation of the issue, but also taps into your passion. It's something that you care about and that you think is important. And I put an emphasis on this thing about that it being some an area that you're passionate about, because this is going to potentially form the background for further research that you do. And to be honest, you need to be, it's much better if you're researching and investigating issues which you feel are important and are kind of enthused about, rather than an area that you have little interest in. So identify something in your practice or that's relevant to your practice that you're keen to find out more about, and in a sense pose a challenge to yourself and other colleagues in the field. Once you've then identified your focus, and hopefully you should already have that focus in place by now, the next aspect of the task is to research that issue. And by that I mean go back to some of the theories, some of the ideas behind the issue. Think about what sort of policy informs or frames that issue, either governmental policy, national policy, or even local policy as well. So think about policy in relation to that issue, and look at examples of practice. Now, those, you might be looking at your own practice, but in particular I would encourage you to look at other people's practice in that area. So this might involve visiting another setting and seeing how they tackle a particular issue, or it may involve reading online evaluations of other practices elsewhere, nationally or even internationally. But the sense is that you are researching the issue theoretically in policy terms and in practice terms. You're then, the third stage of this task then is to think about the implications of this research in terms of yours and your own practice in your setting. So perhaps if you're looking at a way of working with children and young people that is developing practice in your setting, and you investigate that in other settings and policy behind that, you're then thinking about, so having developed your knowledge and understanding, how might you bring that back to your setting? How might you develop practice in your own setting? And then the final stage is, in the sense of the task, is to step back in further and to look at the process of what you've been through in terms of researching, what issues are for you, what you've learnt about children and young people more generally, what the implications are for others in the field, either in practice terms or policy terms or management terms. But you're kind of stepping back from that process of researching the issue and thinking about your practice, and you're looking at a broader sense of analysis and reflection for yourself and children, young people, and for other adults. So those 4 stages are identifying the task, researching the issue, thinking about implications for you and in relation to your own practice, and then a final stage of observing, reflecting and analysing broader issues for you, for children, young people, and for other adults. And so, moving on then to the actual presentation itself. And remember, the expectation is that you record with a video recorder or some description your presentation to the group. We suggest you allow about 15 minutes for the presentation, plus about 5 minutes beyond that for any questions or discussions arising from the presentation. So we're looking for about 20 minutes in total for the presentation. If there are any difficulties in undertaking the recording, then if you can, to let us know. And one of the issues I've picked out here at the bottom of this slide is have a go at practice recording it and then reviewing the recording to make sure that you know how to use the equipment okay, but as a way of reviewing your own presentation before perhaps you do it for real. So we would like you to invite a group of colleagues. I think if you can, choose yourself who you want to invite. A small group, probably about 6, probably no fewer than 4, and probably no more than 8 in total, about half a dozen people. And brief them beforehand that you're making the presentation. And over the course of the presentation, one of the things obviously we want you to do is to focus on the learning that you've developed, because remember this is part of your reflective practice module, the learning you've developed around the issue that you researched, but also in terms of the implications of that learning into your own practice and elsewhere. So in a sense, as well as describing, if you like, others' work, think about what the implications are for your learning all the way through. Doing presentations of this kind, for some of you, may be very straightforward and you feel very comfortable doing this. For others, we know this will be a challenge, in the same way that for some people writing an essay is a real challenge. So if we can, we do suggest you practice it. And if you can, it's much better to use notes in the form of perhaps a prompt cards rather than reading from a script. That's just one of the tips we suggest. We tend to find that if you read from a script, you don't get the same flow of meaning from your presentation. Because remember, in a sense, what you're doing is you're using the visual prompts from either a PowerPoint or flip chart material or whatever, as well as your vocal presentation. So we suggest, if you can, that you don't use a script per se, but use some notes to prompt you. And then, as I said, we would recommend that you practice it, record it, time it, and although it can be quite painful looking back at your own recordings, have a look back and see which bits you would amend before you do it for real. So, thinking about the actual presentation itself and the use of slides. The first thing I want to say about using slides, as I'm doing in this presentation myself, is if you can, try not to over-clutter them. Don't try to either use too much text on the slides themselves or use too many images which might distract from the issue that you're focusing on. Sometimes I think that we tend towards trying to make the slides a bit too flashy in some ways and have things zooming in and out. I would probably tend towards doing things in a fairly straightforward manner, and not wanting to distract from either what your verbal presentation is about or the information that you're presenting on the slides. So try not to overclutter things. Try and chunk the material into specific issues or themes. You've only got about 15 minutes. So really, in that time, you've probably not got a huge amount of time to cover significant points. It might be, for example, that you plan to give over 3 or 4 main issues that you want to explore. And in some ways, it's much better to do those in more depth than to try and whiz through lots of slides and, in a sense, only cover things at a very superficial level. Some of you may want to use activities, engage the group in doing something. I suggest you're careful about doing that. What we, in a sense, don't want is a 20-minute presentation of which 15 minutes are the group working in small groups or talking about it as something in pairs, or doing some sort of rank order exercise with cards. The focus really should be on your presentation and the way that you're conveying information and understanding and presenting the themes of your study. So I would be cautious about using too many or occupying too much time with any activities with the group. If you do use any handouts or use any appendices as part of your presentation, make sure you give us a copy of those, and as well as a copy of the slides that you're actually using, or a photocopy of the flip chart paper if you use that method, because we might not be able to read them clearly from your video film. And please make sure you include a list of all the references you've used. Even though this is a verbal presentation with slides, we still would expect you to use references accurately in that process. So in terms of the presentation itself, these 5 areas are the areas I suggest perhaps you use as a template for your presentation. So you might start off by talking to the group about your overall focus, why that issue is relevant to you, why you've chosen it, and why it's relevant now. Why is it an important issue for practice in early years, or in schools, or in youth work projects, or colleges, or wherever? Why that issue is a relevant issue, and introduce, in a sense, the presentation as a whole. I think the second stage then to go on is to talk about the research that you've done into the issue, the way that you've drawn in theory, what policies particularly you've referred to, and what practices you've explored in terms of outside your own setting that you've drawn upon in order to inform your understanding of the issue. Third area to focus on is then thinking about implications for your own practice and the practice of your setting. So in a sense, at that point, you're bringing it back to the practice of your setting, and that's likely to be the issue, the focus that the other people in the presentation are most interested in. So how are we going to use this knowledge, this understanding, these ideas that you've developed? Fourth stage of the presentation will be a bit of a reflection about what you felt were the emerging themes for you and for the work more generally, and moving on finally to what you think are some issues both for you and the centre or the setting in the future. So in a sense, a summary of what you've learned from undertaking the research and the presentation, and where this might inform yours or your setting's further development. So I'm offering those 5 areas up as a kind of a structure for your presentation, in the same way that you might structure a written assignment. The criteria for this assessment task, and of course the other material that you submit as part of this assessment task, the recordings and your learning contracts, will support meeting these criteria. But these are the things we're looking for. I'll just talk through these 4 criteria in turn. First one, engage in constructive critique and development of your own practice in the workplace. In a sense, you're doing that in the way that you are exploring an issue that's of particular relevance. So a constructive critique, you're identifying what the underpinning issues are that others and yourself need to address, and you're really addressing why these issues are issues for you and others now. So in a sense, you're offering some sort of justification or analysis of why you've chosen the issue that you've chosen to explore in your presentation. It's your rationale, if you like, for why you've chosen what you've chosen. Second criteria, inform reflection through research and engage with debates informed by theory. That's where you're really drawing on the research that you undertake in preparation for your presentation. What theoretical understanding have you drawn upon? What's the relationship between policy and practice? So you're demonstrating your ability to reflect and research in that field. The third one, effectively communicate ideas and findings to colleagues in a professional context. That's to do with actually you making the presentation itself and how you went about researching the field that you've researched, how you went about developing ideas, and in the process what were the challenges along the way. And I would expect you to communicate some of those aspects to your group. So how was it for you in terms of undertaking that research and putting together the presentation? And then the final assessment criteria, demonstrate ability to reflect critically on learning, is more to do with the final part of your presentation where you're reflecting on how you've developed, what are the key issues for you, what have you learnt about your own and others' practice, and of course to some extent those issues will also be picked up in your reflective practice recordings as well. So hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea of those 4 assessment criteria, and as always in an assessment task it's important to be mindful of those 4 criteria when you're undertaking the task. And so I think it's important that you undertake some form of self-evaluation in this process as well. And you might then want to talk a little about this in the final of the 4 reflective practice recordings that you'll be accompanying your presentation with when you hand it in. And this is when you're looking back on the process. And my suggestion is that the 3 questions to think about are to what extent were you able to critique yours and others' practice? How well did you engage in researching the field? And in particular, the notion of critiquing your own practice and the practice of your setting can be quite a challenge. To ask yourself and to present that back to colleagues, could we improve our practice in this area, can be quite a difficult issue to grapple with. In a sense, we ask you to do this assignment in this way because we think it's important that you are able to critique your own and other colleagues' practice, and to do that in a professional way, and to do that in a way which enables you and your colleagues to grow and develop professionally in that process. So to what extent were you able to critique yours and others' practice? The second one is to what extent were you successful in presenting your ideas to others, both within the project itself while you're in undertaking the investigation, when you were talking to other people, but also actually within the presentation. So in a sense, were you able to communicate and engage with those professional dialogues that we have all the time with colleagues, but in this case with a particular purpose in mind? And the third area is, to what extent in terms of self-evaluation, what was your key learning from the task overall? What have you learned about the process from the process of undertaking the project and making the presentation? And again, that's something that you might choose to write about in your final reflective practice recording. And then finally, it's important as part of the professional learning process that you get some feedback. Obviously you'll get feedback from your tutors in relation to the assessment task itself, but it might be important to get ask for some feedback from the colleagues that you've made the presentation to. Don't include this feedback in your recording itself, and perhaps ask for feedback at a later date. Sometimes I think it's easier for people to give a bit of feedback, not too long, but a day or 2 after you've made the presentation. So it's still relatively fresh in their mind, but they're not directly in the moment, and they can also do that individually to you. If you do ask for feedback, if you can be very specific about the feedback you ask, so rather than just saying, what did you think of it, ask them for particular aspects of feedback in relation to key things that you presented or in terms of how you presented them. And of course after that, reflect on the feedback, whether you feel it kind of sits with you comfortably, whether their feedback is valid, and how you might use that feedback in your future learning. So I hope this has been a useful kind of a summary of the assessment task itself. I've done it in this way so you then can replay the presentations I've made for clarification. Do talk to your colleagues particularly in your route specific group about this though, and if you've got any queries, raise them with either your reflective practice tutor who will be marking this piece of work or your route specific tutor. And as I say, we'll provide a little later. We'll provide you with a checklist of all the elements that need to go into this assessment task. So that's the end of this podcast, and I look forward to working with you on the next time we either meet for a podcast or as a large group on the Reflective Practice Saturdays.